Welcome to Oncology Morning Commute, Antibody-Drug Conjugates, and the changing relapsed or refractory diffuse large B-cell lymphoma landscape. Morning Commute is developed by Projects and Knowledge, powered by Kaplan, and is part of a continuing medical education series. This independent CME-CE activity is supported by an educational grant from ADC Therapeutics America Incorporated. In the second podcast in this series, Dr. Paolo Cami and Dr. Juan Alderuccio discuss antibody-drug conjugates as treatment options for patients with relapsed or refractory diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. They look at key trial data as well as treatment management in this disease. Information about the faculty and disclosures can be found at morningcommutepodcast.com/BCell2. You can use this link to receive your credit and evaluate this program. The URL can also be accessed in the episode notes. Dr. Cami is on staff in the Department of Hematology and Oncology at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. Dr. Alderuccio is an associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center in Miami, Florida. I am your host, Candace Hoffman. Dr. Cami will begin our discussion.
Welcome to our second podcast on diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. Dr. Alderuccio, welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion and now going to focus a little bit on antibody-drug conjugate therapies and antibody-drug therapies, as well as other drugs for the relapse setting of diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. What are some of the antibody-drug conjugates we have available right now?
Thank you, Dr. Cami. So the antibody-drug conjugates currently available in patients with relapsed refractory diffuse large B-cell lymphoma are loncastuximab tesirine. This is an antibody-drug conjugate against CD19. Polatuzumab vedotin, that is also an antibody-drug conjugate against CD79B, and brentuximab vedotin, that is an anti-CD30.
What is your experience with these drugs using treatment for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma?
Yeah, so loncastuximab has been approved by the FDA in patients treated with at least 2 lines of prior therapies. It has approved after results of the LOTIS-2 trial. It's a medication that has been shown a significant overall response rate and CR rate. And I think what is important about the design of the LOTIS-2 trial is that this trial allowed the enrollment of patients with primary refractory disease and also patients with high-risk features, such as patients with double hit and triple hit, that in some of the trials from other compounds in this setting were excluded or were not enrolled in this population.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I think one of the probably important things of both the 3 drugs that we talked about, loncastuximab, polatuzumab, or brentuximab, they all have activity and they work more like targeted chemotherapeutic agents. They have a little cytotoxic component to them. They behave much more like chemo in my sense than true immunotherapies, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, like you said, I think loncastuximab has, I think moderate single agent activity. It's a drug, but also the interesting thing I think in its study was that, you really had almost the population that is the one that you see in the refractory setting or the relapse setting, people who have all kinds of risk disease and particularly double hits, people who are primary refractory, who fail CAR. So I think in that sense it was a very inclusive trial.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing for polatuzumab is primarily the tolerability. I think it was interesting. I think the combinability with chemotherapy at the time was important. Although I think I was somewhat underwhelmed about its single agent activity on the original studies, but I think in combination, I think it has, good response rate. It did demonstrate improved outcome over bendamustine, although bendamustine, I think most of us tend to think that it's not, or bendamustine rituximab, it's just not a regimen for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. So certainly, I think it's a drug that has its space there, but in the combo And the question is whether it has better partners, like we probably will see with the polarics, or subsequent combination with other drugs like bispecifics. How about brentuximab? Do you use brentuximab occasionally in diffuse large B? I've had a little bit of experience with it, but
I haven't used it. No.
yeah, I have been able to use it in combination for certain patients who have CD30 positive disease, and I think it still has some activity, although it's a very restricted number of patients, I think primarily because of the CD30 expression of being that very common. How about tolerability of these agents? I think it's kind of special because there's different components to them, right? With both the target and the payload being part of it.
Yeah, I agree. With the loncastuximab, it's important to remember the patient needs to receive dexamethasone the day before, the day of treatment, and the day after to decrease the incidence of third space collection that was a potential adverse reaction observed in the phase 1 when premedication with steroids was not mandatory. And also it's important to remember that patients should avoid sun exposure because may develop rash and sometimes can take long time to resolve in these patients. Also, patients need to wait frequently to monitor for third space collection, and patients that they increase the weight, usually more than 1 kilogram per day. The use of diuretics, especially aldactone, has been shown to also to partially at least address these adverse reactions. So these things need to be taken into consideration when we use this drug. Also, it's important to remember that in the LODRIS-2, patients with third space collection and patients with bulky disease defined with mass more than 10 centimeters were excluded from the trial. So I think also we need to consider those two exclusion criteria at the time of selecting this compound in patients. Regarding polatuzumab vedotin, as you mentioned, we frequently use with bendamustine rituximab. Usually it's a overall well-tolerated drug. The most common toxicities are neutropenia, and that's why patients need to usually use growth factor support to decrease the time or at least prevent partially this toxicity. And then we observe some anemia and thrombocytopenia. I have never seen significant hematological toxicity with polatuzumab plus bendamustine rituximab. So I don't think that is a limiting toxicity in this setting. Regarding brentuximab vedotin, the neuropathy, it can be an issue. So also patients with significant neuropathy were excluded from the trial.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the particular characteristics of antibody-drug conjugates as a class is that you cannot really consider them to have a class effect definition, right? Because it's really, you can have different targets and different payloads, and depending on that, you'll see different toxicities. And I think that's probably why you see that difference between loncastuximab and polatuzumab and brentuximab, because the payload is so different, and with a neuropathy component for the latter two, and this sun sensitivity, fluid retention for lonca, which are first in class because the payload is the first one first time it's included in a ADC. Mm-hmm. I think that maybe the hematologic toxicity of lonca, so it's somewhat more pronounced, or it's a little more of a common thing that we're used to manage. Although I think for hematology people who treat lymphoma, hematologic toxicity is not a major issue. I think it does take a learning curve to manage these drugs. I think for lonca, I think is knowing fluid overload is something that you have to be careful about. You need to, and also think the sun exposure is something that can actually, I think we can do it here in Ohio, but I'm not sure you can do it there in Florida and in the, almost all throughout the year. Yeah, I think the other interesting thing for polatuzumab, bendamustine, brentuximab, as well as loncastuximab, all these drugs have their toxicities, and they have a specific peak and time to kind of develop. And I think at least my approach with both polatuzumab and brentuximab is the moment I start seeing neuropathy, I know I need to start backing up because they can peak rather quickly. And I think with loncastuximab, it may be rather similar, except that the presentation is different, right? So I tend to, the moment you start seeing fluid retention, you should start thinking about doing interventions. You need to make sure you get the steroids before. So I think that rapid escalation of adverse events without intervention is something that you need to kind of be aware of as a practitioner. And definitely the sun exposure is something that I think we weren't used to as much with most of the drugs that we use, although I think it's something we should be telling to patients, even with chemotherapy. How do you think this all fits in the armamentarium now, considering that we also have tafasitamab lenalidomide with a study that the Almine study that allowed treatment second line and third line? How do you include these drugs kind of in your decision tree of relapsed diffuse large B-cell lymphoma?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So usually I prefer, so as you mentioned previously, there are data supporting the use of loncastuximab after CAR T failure patients. So if a clinical trial is not available in this setting, especially the use of bispecifics, my choice in this setting is to use loncastuximab based on publications on the use of loncastuximab after. I try to, I do same as in the trial, I repeat the biopsy and make sure that the lymphoma still express CD19 before the use of loncastuximab. Tafasitamab with lenalidomide and polatuzumab vedotin both were approved, and the trials were in patients that were not eligible for transplant. So if a patient has worse performance status, probably my selection will be to one of those. And I usually choose based on the presence of comorbidities or presence of already. If the patient already has neuropathy, I would try to avoid the use of polatuzumab vedotin because although the incidence of neuropathy is lower compared to brentuximab, maybe an adverse reaction of this compound. So in that population, I will use tafasitamab lenalidomide. Also, in the subgroup analysis of the bendamustine rituximab with polatuzumab trial, patients with GCB subtype didn't respond well. This was a ad hoc subgroup analysis, but I try to don't take decisions on subgroup analysis, but the same data was observed in the POLARIX. So it seems that polatuzumab vedotin is not so effective in patients that do not present an ABC phenotype. So in a patient with GCB, I may more inclined to use tafasitamab with lenalidomide.
It's interesting. I think that the abundance of options right now, I think we considering, and this is not even talking about CAR Ts, right? This is a patient that we would consider either after CAR T or a CAR T ineligible patient. I think the way we're making our decision to offer different treatments probably varies about how much comfort we have with our treatments, how much we've used them. We are both spoiled in the sense that we probably have trials for most of these patients for whom we probably don't use many of these drugs because we're putting our patients on trial. But I think it really comes to kind of having a little decision tree and algorithm that maybe is a little bit different for everybody. I have not necessarily taken into account the cell of origin for use of polatuzumab based therapies, but I think that it may be an observation that's valid. I think I found it interesting that both in front line and second line or second, third line would be an issue. for a drug that you would think that would be cell of origin agnostic, correct? But on the other hand, for me, it's similar, although not exactly the same. I think I tend to prefer to use tafasitamab in the second line. I think half of the patients who were enrolled were patients who were transplant ineligible. Now I think CAR-T eligible patients would go that. I think the chances of response are probably rather higher on that group. Late relapsers, it gives me a little bit of option. It's usually for the elderly or very elderly patients for whom that alternative is an option. I tend to worry a little bit about the doses of lenalidomide. And I think that hematologic toxicity may be underestimated in that group, and it's probably a little bit higher in real world. And then I think the decision is for post-CAR T relapses. I think I'm usually hinging between, in a non-CAR T setting, or a non-trial setting, I'm hinging between Lonca and polatuzumab BR, and thinking that the patient who's had significant neuropathy, a lot of our CAR T failures right now kind of come with their neuropathy because they've gotten CHOP and they've gotten ICE, or they've gotten platinum agents, so they kind of come with some neuropathy on board for whom polatuzumab may be a little bit of an issue. Whereas I think Lonca is a little bit more manageable in terms of their side effect profile being different than what they've seen so far. But I think logistics, fluid overload, I think are things that I tend to take into account. And I think I always worry with CAR-T. I've been making sure that at least I attempt a biopsy showing persistence of CD19, although I think CD19, it happens in about a third, maybe somewhat less patients with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma who relapse after CAR-Ts, loss of CD19. But I think the trial, LOTIS-2, required a biopsy in those people who had a CAR-T prior, and having expression of CD19 was desired for patients to be enrolled. Not sure that necessarily is necessary for a response. Maybe it's lower rates of expression of CD19 are still useful for Lonca, but I think that was kind of how patients were enrolled, so I still check it.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think when we talked most about the adverse events, I think how do you generally approach a patient that fails these therapies? Do you switch them around, or do you? I mean, you're probably having trials. What other considerations do you use? Do you use selinexor much on these patients?
No, I can never use selinexor in this setting. The overall response rate in the trial was pretty low, was around 28% overall response rate with a CR rate of 12%, and also associated with a safety profile that may produce significant thrombocytopenia, and the nausea associated with vomiting is not a drug that I have used, and I usually select other agents before choosing selinexor. Have you used it?
I have used it. I think that I think that the problem with our clinical experience with relapse therapy, therapies for relapse patients, is that we generally have trials for this patient. I think most of our trials right now are probably with the drugs that are coming probably next in this setting, which will be bispecifics or combinations of them. And I think that those deserve mention in this discussion. I think they probably will be part of this, make our decision tree even more complicated. Certainly CD20/CD3 bispecific antibodies will make an impact in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. I think they'll be interesting agents to evaluate whether how they fit into this program. I think they have significant activity. I think they'll be interesting because there appear to be combinable agents, and the question is, can you combine them with cytotoxics if you need T cells for the response, or does that matter at all? So I think it'll be an interesting development. Certainly an area that's changing, right? I think it changes uncomfortable, but it's definitely good for the press.
No, I agree. And also, if the use of polatuzumab with in the frontline setting in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma may change how we use in the second line. If we decide to use polatuzumab in untreated setting, I would probably select other agents rather than polatuzumab and rituximab at the time of relapse in the same patient.
I agree with you. I think that that's something that that I'm not sure that everybody will adopt polatuzumab R-CHOP, but I think that we'll see it in a significant proportion of our patients. And I think we'll have to adapt, because I think that we don't know if we can re-expose patients to polatuzumab and obtain a response. I think most of us, I think kind of our oncology training says, don't re-expose the patient to a drug the patient failed or that failed the patient. But I think in theory, I think that we've seen it with brentuximab, the re-exposure to brentuximab sometimes can achieve responses. It's definitely a shifting rug where things are moving. We'll see a mixture of patients that are relapsed after R-CHOP, patients that are refractory to polatuzumab at the beginning, polar-CHOP at the beginning. So it's kind of testing our adaptability to choose what is best for our patients. And in addition to this, new drugs coming up on this refractory setting, and CAR-Ts kind of, like I said before, taking most of the oxygen out of the room. So it's very interesting. Thank you very much. I think we'll conclude this section of the series and we'll move on to the next subject. Thank you.
Thank you.
Remember, to receive your credit and evaluate this program, please visit morningcommutepodcast.com/BCell2. Look for all of the episodes in this series and all of our other podcasts on your favorite podcast streaming services, or download our Morning Commute app. Thank you for joining us today.